Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this very special event this evening, or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. In a slight change of plan, Garth Greenwell won't be joining us due to unforeseen circumstances, and we're very sorry not to have him here with us. However, we are delighted to be hosting Brandon Taylor in conversation with Alim Karaj. And thank you both for agreeing to change things around so quickly. I'm the publisher of Daunt Books Publishing, and we were very proud to publish Brandon's debut novel, Real Life, on the 30th of July this year, just after it was longlisted for this year's Booker Prize. Alim recently interviewed Brandon for the I newspaper, and we're pleased to be able to expand on and continue that conversation today. And I'm sure there'll be a chance to discuss Garth's writing too in his absence. The discussion will last for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for audience questions. You can post these on the comment section as the event is taking place, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Both Brandon and Garth's books are available to order on our website now, and as an event special, we also have signed copies of Real Life, which I urge you to snap up as supplies are very limited. I'll introduce our guests, excuse me, and then hand over to Alim. Brandon Taylor is the senior editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading and a staff writer at LitHub. His writing has earned him fellowships from Lambda Literary Foundation, Kimbilio Fiction, and the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop in Fiction. Real Life is his debut novel. It's an elegant, brutal, and startlingly intimate campus novel, which was described as calm to being, as tender, deeply felt, and perfectly paced. Alim Karaj is a freelance writer and editor from London, whose work has focused on the intersection of queerness and popular culture. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, GQ, The Eye, The Observer, ID, Vice, Gay Times, and Time Out. His first book, Queer London, is a guide to LGBTQ+ London past and present, and is due for publication in 2021. You can find him on Twitter at Alim Karaj. Thank you both.
Thanks so much. Yes, really excited to be here and in conversation with you again, Brandon. Just wanted to give you another little introduction to everyone. Brandon's book, Real Life, was published by Daunt Books last month and was recently longlisted for the Booker Prize. It was described as The Guardian as psychologically compelling, incisively satirical, and told in a muted style that nevertheless accesses a full range of emotions. And it tells the story of Wallace, a Black gay man studying in the Midwest. And it's set over one weekend and explores the politics of intimacy, as well as the corrosive nature of trauma, racism, grief, violence, ennui, and desire. And to kick things off, we're going to have Brandon do a short reading from the book for us.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I feel so validated and seen. Ennui, trauma, and restlessness are my sort of interests in life. Yeah, so I'm just going to read from the book. Very, very short, the opening pages, so you don't need any context, hopefully, if I've done my job well. So here we go, from Real Life. It was a cool evening in late summer when Wallace, his father dead for several weeks, decided that he would meet his friends at the pier after all. The lake was dimpled with white waves. People coveted these last blustery days of summer before the weather turned cold and mercurial. The air was heavy with their good times as the white people scattered across the tiered patios, pried their mouths apart, and beamed their laughter into each other's faces. Overhead, gulls drifted easy as anything. Wallace stood on an upper platform looking down into the scrum, trying to find his particular group of white people, thinking also that it was still possible to turn back, that he could go home and get on with his evening. It had been a couple of years since he had gone to the lake with his friends, a period of time that embarrassed him because it seemed to demand an excuse and he did not have one. It might have had something to do with the crowds, the insistence of other people's bodies, the way the birds circled overhead, then dive-bombed the tables to grab food or root around at their feet as though even they were socializing. Threats from every corner. There was also the matter of the noise, the desperate braying of everyone talking over everyone else, the bad music, the children and dogs, the radios from the frats down the lake shore, the car stereos in the streets, the shouting mass of hundreds of lives disagreeing. The noise demanded vague and strange things from Wallace. There, among the burgundy wooden tables nearest the lake, he saw the four of them. Or no, more specifically, he saw Miller, who was extraordinarily tall, the easiest to spot, then Ingva and Cole, who were merely tall, and then Vincent, who just scraped under the bar of average height. Miller, Ingva, and Cole looked like a trio of pale, upright deer, like they belonged to their own particular species, and you could be forgiven if you were in a hurry for thinking them related. Like Wallace and their other friends, they'd all come to this Midwestern city to pursue graduate studies in biochemistry. Their class had been the first small one in quite some time, and the first in more than 3 decades to include a Black person. In his less generous moments, Wallace thought these two things related, that a narrowing, a reduction in the number of applicants had made his admission possible. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start off by asking perhaps the most rudimentary of questions, but one that I think is still interesting, was where the kind of germination for the idea for the book came from.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of more mercenary answer to that question is that I had a literary agent at the time who kept asking me when I was gonna write a novel, and every time he'd ask, I'd say, no, I'm a story writer, and he'd be like, yeah, but like the novel though. And I got sick of that question, and I decided that I would write a novel so that this agent would let me sort of write in peace. And so I sat down and set out to write a novel, capital N novel. And in doing so, I was like, okay, like what is the kind of novel that I want to write? And I was like, well, I want to write a campus novel because I love them so much. And then I was like, okay, I want to write a campus novel, except this time I want to put like a queer Black person at the center of it because we never really get much say in that particular genre of book. And so it really came out of this, at first, mercenary attempt to write a book so that oh, did I pop out? No, yes. Are we back?
We're back.
Okay, great. Okay, so it came at first out of this attempt to sort of write a book so that this agent would leave me alone, but it really, quite quickly became about, exercising my own obsessions with the genre of the campus novel, and trying to tell a story like the one that I had experienced and that many people I loved had experienced, and that being the sort of lonely experience of being considered other in an otherwise ostensibly progressive space.
The campus novel. We talked about this before when I interviewed you. It's something that I don't know that people in the UK will necessarily be familiar with, especially in the American tradition. And I was wondering, if you could kind of expand a bit more about why it was you wanted to kind of explore that genre.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, I started school when I was 4 years old, and I didn't finish my formal education until I was 30. And right. So I spent a lot of time in schools and on campuses. And so like part of it is just like so much of my life has been taken up by education as like a force. Right. But the campus novel to me is always really interesting because a campus is like, it's like one of the first places you as like a human come into contact with people who might be quite different from you. Like you come into contact with people who are richer than you, who are less advantaged than you, people who come from different backgrounds and faiths, and they're all sort of thrown together in sort of one one set of constraints. And the rules of society, like the rules of society are present on campuses, but campuses also function by their own set of like weird hierarchies, traditions, and rituals. And so they're this kind of like parasocial space. And like that's just like quite interesting to me, the sort of innate friction of taking all of these people from these different walks of life, from these different geographical locations, and people with different families and ideas about the world, and putting them in one place. And often it's like young people who are on campus, right? So people who are in the process of becoming and figuring out what they want from life. What does the world look like? People who are finding out about history and the world and society at large for the first time. And so it's often like a quite exciting, volatile time in a life. And so that's really the set of things that I'm interested in, is like the campus as a space to sort of ask probing questions about, like how does a person become? How does a person come to consciousness? And what happens when you are suddenly made aware of the fact that your life is undergirded by all of these forces you may not have considered before? And so that's just like quite interesting to me. I mean, it's like, any person who's interested in narrative or drama, like how can you sort of not be excited by the prospect of a bunch of young people testing their ideas out on each other?
I mean, you definitely have that in Wallace's friendship group, with people pushing buttons and kind of testing the limits of things. But also, considering that they're in graduate programs, they are fairly emotionally underdeveloped.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is like nobody gets into a graduate program by accident. Like it's a fairly self-selected group of people. And often it's like people who have spent their entire lives, being called smart and being called incredibly precocious in like one way, and sort of leaning into that as an identity, such that you actually don't develop sometimes like robust social skills. Like your capacity to interact with like other adult humans is often not what one might hope. I mean, I've been in 2 graduate programs now, and it never ceases to amaze me that like the extent to which people just like have insight and have such intelligence but don't have wisdom. Like, have no sense of like perspective or proportion, and yet they can tell you everything about Jane Austen, and yet they have no idea how to do like taxes, or how to like function in like a person-to-person context that isn't sort of contextualized by academia. Like you take away academia and grad students are just like, I don't know how to be without academia as like a backdrop. Like, who am I?
But you've managed to avoid that, I feel. The novel is, it's, as I said, it's sort of, it does traverse all these different facets of human emotion and human experience. And you have to be quite in touch with yourself in order to, well, I feel you must be, I don't know, but you must have to be kind of in touch with yourself in order to get that on page and distill that into writing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the great scams of literature is that it allows people to confuse introspection for wisdom. Like like, in a novel, introspection can come off as being like quite, like emotionally aware and emotionally nuanced and sophisticated. And like that's like maybe one of the great mechanisms of literature, is to sort of turn introspection into like actual wisdom about the world in some ways. As for myself, like I've had a lot of therapy, and as a child, I was like really lonely, and I had to get really good at like reading fairly volatile family dynamics. And so like when I went to graduate school, it was just that, except instead of my family, it was like this group of people who many of whom like didn't have that same degree of like reading social currents, and so like they would just sort of buff it against each other and not know why they were clanging so much. And I'd just be like, no, everyone's feelings are hurt and no one is aware of why or how the feelings got hurt, and I'm just like trapped in the middle. It's like being the only person in a game of bumper cars without a bumper car. You're just like out there exposed to all of their volatility. But I think for myself, like it comes from just being like an introspective child in a very traumatic family situation, and I just got really good at reading the sort of social currents and the tensions in the room, and like my own sort of, to whatever extent I have emotional intelligence, I think just comes from like a set of, you know, robust coping mechanisms from familial trauma.
Because I mean, obviously Garth unfortunately isn't with us, but you know, one of the things that I think Cleanness does so well is, and what he does so well, is he gets on the page what consciousness is. And I feel like real life does that too, but you do it, you know, Garth writes in the first person, it's very close prose, whereas the narrator in real life, kind of, we hear about what Wallace is going through the narrator's eyes, and the narrator feels almost more knowledgeable than Wallace is himself. And I was wondering whether you could kind of talk a little bit about, I don't know, how kind of both. Let me start that again. How third person and first person allows you to traverse the same sort of spheres.
Yeah, I mean, Garth is one of our great masters of introspection. And, you know, he's turning it into like real wisdom, not like fake wisdom. You know, I think that first person, that is like one of the sort of natural strengths of first person, is that you're sort of in a consciousness and that you're quite close to the character as they're sort of realizing things. And so one can attribute exposition to that character's own sort of mindset or thoughts. And in third person, it's a bit trickier, right? Because there's this, you know, to varying degrees of opacity, there's like an intermediary between the reader and the character, and that is like the narrator. Sometimes the narrator and the character collapse, you know, with like free and direct discourse, and sometimes there is quite a bit of distance. And in my own work, I'm I'm like quite interested in narrators who know more about a character than a character does. Like I'm really interested in stories that allow characters to sort of retain some of the integrity of their own interior states, and to sort of not have to expose that to the reader. Like I'm interested in characters who have depths and who have hidden cavities within them that the reader can sort of feel but can't sort of peer directly into. And I feel like that just comes from all the Zola I read far too early in life. You know, I read a lot of Zola when I was trying to impress a French instructor I had in college. And so, you know, he'd be like, oh yeah, you should read these books. And so in order to impress him, I would just spend all these hours like reading Zola and Entrégide, like in the original French, you know, like Le Disons Soif in the original French is like a really, you know, really different, and a lot of Stendhal. And, you know, I think it just comes from like the naturalist tradition, where you have these very sometimes opaque narrators talking about characters who are being buffeted and acted upon by forces that they don't themselves they don't know the name of those forces, but the narrator does. And so I'm interested in that, but I'm also deeply at the same time, and I feel like this is one of the tensions in my work, I am interested in the interior states of a character. And so I'm always fighting with myself about what is like direct access versus indirect access to the character's interior state, and how can I sort of get at that without being too explicit, because I don't want to write fiction in first person. Like I wouldn't even know how to begin to write fiction in first person. It's not a thing that interests me because I simply cannot do it. And I don't like to waste time trying to do things I can't do. So, you know, I think first person wins in that way, and that it does allow this sort of direct, almost repertorial access to a character's interior states. And I'm more interested in the sort of, in the gesture that gets you that information, but you've got to do a little bit more work to interpret it, because you don't have a sort of direct line all the time to a character's interior being. And that just comes from so much Zola.
Well, again, it's ironic. Obviously, you say I couldn't write in first person when there is obviously a first person sort of section in the book, which I don't want to spoil it for anyone that hasn't read it. But it is different than what I would say Garth does. Although you did say to me the last time we spoke that when you were going in to write that section, you wanted to pull a Greenwell. And I was, what did you mean by that? Can you just sort of explain for people?
Yeah, so the sort of, I mean, when I set out to write the book, I had a list of things I wanted to do. And one of the things I wanted was at the exact geographical center of the book, I wanted there to be this register break. And I wanted there to be what I was calling like a hyper lyric Faulknerian monologue. And when I said I was going to pull a Greenwell, the way that I explained it to myself was like, it's going to be like this long section. I was envisioning it to be like 30 pages, but that is not what happened. It was going to be like a section in sort of a single unbroken paragraph, because Garth's book has that great sort of block paragraph section, which Garth later told me over coffee. One of the great things about living in Iowa City is that I get to see Garth like all the time, or I did before the pandemic, but Garth told me, he's like, no, I stole that from Bernhardt, sweetie. Like, that's not mine. I stole it from Thomas Bernhardt. And he stole it from Sebald, and so maybe I was just pulling a Sebald. But so I wanted there to be like this section in the book that was a block paragraph that contained all the things that no other section in the book could contain, and that it would be Wallace being the most explicit he is in the entire book about, his past or whatever. But I never set out to write that in first person. Like, I knew that I wanted the language to be like I wanted the language to undergo a kind of phase change, and that it would go from this like very narrative, very sort of clinical language to like this, under such duress and pressure to explain his past, his language has to undergo this phase change and go to this higher energy state, like a sublimation almost. And so that's what I was reaching for, and accidentally wrote it in first person. And by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, oh, this is in first person. I guess I have to rewrite it, but then I didn't want to. And I was like, well, I'll just keep writing and see if I can justify it structurally to myself. And then I could. And so I was like, okay, it can stay. I don't have to revisit the most difficult material in the book.
Yeah, as you say, it's the first time that we get to hear from Wallace. But although we've heard him speak throughout the book, it is such a tonal change for him. Wallace is quite, not monosyllabic, but he doesn't share a lot, and he says things like "I'm fine" which is a phrase that loses all meaning by the end of the book. I'm sort of interested in how, in what kind of process you go through to know the character.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, for me, the characters just come. I mean, often I have some sense of, for me, a character first walks into my life as like a set of clothes. Like I can see their wardrobe before I can see them in many cases. And so by knowing what they dress like, I know who they are, like where they're from, kind of like what they're into. Like I understand them sort of obliquely through the way they dress. And then with that comes voice. And then come a set of mannerisms. And, in the process of drafting, I sort of write a scene, and like the character is sort of coherent in my mind, but they often don't become fully coherent until I get them interacting with another character. So like, I knew that the four boys that he meets at the pier or three boys, Ingva, Miller, and Cole, and Vincent, the four boys that he meets at the pier, were going to be there, but I didn't have a sense of their exact person. I didn't know how the group dynamic was really going to play out until I got them all in a scene together. And then I get to figure out like, oh, Miller's the kind of surly, childish one, like Ingva's like the playful one, Vincent's the irritating one, Cole is like this like good-natured, I'm going to try to be a peacekeeper kind of person. Like those traits emerged as I was like writing the dialogue and figuring out what sounded right and what didn't sound right, and just sort of like feeling my way through. So, like I start out with a set of like ideas about who they are and what they are, but really it's the characters through writing their dialogue and refining those exchanges that I feel like home in on like who they are as people. So it's just a process of like writing a line of dialogue and being like, oh no, he's not the type to say that. Like let's try to find a different thing. Yeah.
Because I mean the dynamic within the friendship group is interesting. You know, when we see a scene, there's a dinner party scene just before the kind of middle of the book where the kind of cracks in their dynamic all begin to show, and everything kind of blows apart, and the dynamics that Wallace assumes are there actually all kind of come undone and come anew. So how do you go from having this idea about the structure of them to then going to this secondary section where, you know, they don't change as people, but you as the reader understand them differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of just, you know, as I said, I mean, I know that some people don't like group scenes. I know that some people don't enjoy them, but I, as a writer, really love writing them because everybody shows up with a different agenda, and you get to sort of tease those agendas out over the course of an exchange. And for me, it's a lot of, oh, they're asking if the feed is still on.
Yeah, yes, it is.
Great. Oh, you asked that. Okay.
That was me.
So I love getting characters into a scenario where it's like the character and like 4 to 5 other characters, and everyone's sort of putting pressure on each other. I mean, the way that I try to keep in sight like what is right for each character and each dynamic is like, I ask myself, am I being too easy on them? Am I letting them just sort of like dip below the surface and not have to respond to something that was said to them? Or like, am I sort of, if a character would naturally intervene in a moment, am I holding them back because that would be too messy or whatever? I mean, the first draft of that dinner party scene, you know, I struggled with it at first because I was like, this feels very polite. Nothing really changed here. There was no sort of catastrophic thing. And so I had to revisit it and sort of be like, okay, like Wallace, there's a moment where Wallace needs to do a thing, and I don't want him to do it because it's going to make everything so much harder for me as a writer, because then I've got to like manage the fallout. But I had to do it. I had to go back and be like, okay, like this scene is like low energy when it would be very high stakes for everyone here. So I've got to just dig in and try to excavate those stakes and make sure that the characters are acting in a way that is like truthful to themselves and to their intentions. And yeah, I mean, I just had to go back and let the characters be their messy selves and try to hold on for dear life as the writer.
Because you don't let them get away with things, and the book doesn't let the reader get away from situations, from things either. You sit in discomfort quite a lot. You know, it happens, you know, at the dinner party. It happens in the various interactions with Wallace and Miller. Like it can't be avoided. And why was it important for you to exist within that discomfort in that space?
Well, I mean, part of it is because, you know, I think a lot about D.H. Lawrence's idea of the moral novel or like moral art, and that's art that maintains the sort of natural correspondences between things and sort of reveals things as they really are and doesn't try to like put the finger on the scale so it's easier for the writer or for the reader. And it really felt like if I was going to write a moral novel, like a truthful novel, then I had to be willing to sort of force the reader to sit in discomfort. Like there's no way to sort of tell a story that is morally rigorous and also 100% comfortable all of the time for the reader. Like oftentimes if the reader exits your book feeling only like a little pinprick of discomfort, then ultimately you have failed as a novelist, I feel. And so like, I never want to let the reader or the characters off too easy. Like I never want to be protective. I want to tell the truth. And so discomfort to me is a part of that. You know, it's an uncomfortable scenario to be the only Black person at a dinner party, and where people are saying racist and classist and sometimes homophobic things. Like that's not comfortable for Wallace. So then why should it be comfortable for the reader? Like why what kind of message does that send to the reader that like, oh, this is like really sucky for him, but I'm going to hold your hand and protect you from it. Like, that is not my job as the novelist. My job is not to insulate the reader from the discomfort of the world, but to reveal it. And hopefully that something comes out of that exchange with the character. And so like Wallace, I was determined that if Wallace was going to be uncomfortable, the reader had to feel that. Otherwise, it's not a truthful novel. It's propaganda for liberal guilt. And like, that's not what I'm trying to do. So yeah, the discomfort to me, it's not that morality is uncomfortable. It's just that if you're telling the truth about a character's circumstances, and those circumstances are uncomfortable for the character, then a moral novel holds the reader to account for that, and it doesn't allow them to just sort of slip away.
But you don't provide answers for the reader either. You know, Wallace doesn't suddenly figure it all out. Neither does Miller, and neither does his friends. You know, they might be aware, but I don't know if they ever come to a point where they're like, oh, I'm sort of aware, I'm, you know, cognizant of everything and can see how all these different things have played out and why this has happened and why this has happened.
Yeah, I mean, it would have felt false to have some kind of revelatory, you know, like some kind of like revelatory moment in the book. That would have felt false in some way, because Wallace is not a race prophet. Like, Wallace is not, you know, like that ultimately is not what Wallace's goal is not to educate white people about racism or these systemic issues. Like, Wallace's goal is to maybe finish grad school, but ultimately to find a set of circumstances that he feels he can survive. And so like his goal is not to sort of solve systemic racism. His goal is to survive graduate school. And so like it would have felt false to sort of tack on some sort of preachy, like didactic lesson about racism, because I mean the sad truth is Wallace's fate is that he's just got to like hang out with these people for 3 to 4 more years, right? Like the sad part is like he's got to be here with them, and there is no answer, there is no resolution to you know, there's no resolution to that. He's gotta live in it, and they do too. And like they don't come into some deep, heartfelt, life-changing revelation about racism. You know, what they do is they realize like, oh, I was really shitty to my friend this weekend, I'm gonna maybe try to do better next week, and maybe I won't do better. But you know, like that's the truth of that scenario. That's like the truthful part of that outcome, is that no, like you don't like wake up and you're suddenly anti-racist. That's not how it works.
No. and Miller and Wallace, you know, you say Wallace is looking for a kind of a way to survive, but he does get involved in this quite volatile, quite violent, intense, romantic, kind of romantic, I don't know if we would call it romantic,
yeah,
kind of situation. And I sort of was interested in that. You know, when Garth was going to join us, I wanted to talk specifically really about how sex and desire manifest themselves in both of your novels, because I feel like sex in Cleanness is very transformational and it's sort of sacrosanct, it's religious almost. But, you know, for Wallace, desire and sex is more caustic, and sex isn't pleasurable even for him. And there's that fabulous moment in the ice cream parlor where Wallace sees this attractive man, and then, you know, there's 2 paragraphs of him just sort of spiraling out of control. You know, oh God, I hate myself, I hate my body, I basically don't want to exist. I was sort of interested in, you know, why sex and desire manifested themselves in that way in your novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is something I mean, Garth and I talk about this all the time, often over frozen yogurt. You know, that's sort of like not the third rail, because we talk about it with great delight and glee, but it's one of the things that we diverge maybe the most on, is our attitudes to sex and how we explore that in our work. I mean, like, yes, like Garth is, I think, like one of the great spiritualists of like cum swapping or something like that. Yeah. But, he sees it as like this transformation, and I certainly am willing to go there with him in his work because he does such a brilliant job of writing it. But in my own work, I'm deeply interested in the kind of both like the existential dread of queer desire and also the ambivalence of it. Like, what is at the heart of like gay desire for me, and what do I think about it? And like we've had a lot of novels. We've had some gay novels in which like sex is like a sort of central driving ethos, and that certainly seems to be the heart of contemporary gay male literature. Is like the app. What do I do? What, like, he doesn't want me. Oh no, I'm so sad. And like I'm just like not interested in that. Like I'm interested in what desire means. Like in the case of Wallace, like Wallace is someone who's had a great deal of like sexual trauma and sexual violence in his life. And I'm interested in the legacy of that. I'm interested in sort of tracing out like what that means. And so for Wallace, desire is sort of inextricably linked, sexual desire and a desire to be destroyed and obliterated. Like that's sort of everything that Wallace wants. It comes back to a desire to be obliterated or annihilated or erased. There's that section so deep in section 5 where he talks about God and the devil and a desire to just sort of be torn apart and just inhabited by some other force. And so that's, I think, at the core of all of my writing, is like this set of circling preoccupations with sex and like what it means in a life when your sexual history has become disordered because of violence and trauma and all this other stuff. And also when you're just like a super heady, weirdly intense young man, as Wallace also is. And so that's what I'm interested in. Like, I'm not interested in the transformational sort of spiritual aspects of sex. I think there are plenty of advocates and brilliant writers who write about that, but I have no access to that. I don't even know how one would begin to think about sex in that way. And two, I just, when I sit down to write, I'm like, okay, like, what do I want to read? And I often, it's because I, in my own life, sex is like this unresolved question. It's this unresolved set of preoccupations that I cannot stop. Like, I just cannot stop thinking about like sex, and it's sort of, the way that it butts up against destruction and stuff like that. So that's what I'm trying to write. I'm trying to write into that, the sort of, not the dark heart of gay sex, but like the ambivalence and existential dread of it, and how for some people it is inextricable from a desire to be destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, there are some scenes where, I don't want to give again too much away, but where Miller and Wallace quite literally trying to destroy each other. It's not even psychological. It's it's very physical.
I mean, and to me, like, that's what happens when you get two people who have a history of violence and whose only way, like the only way they know how to bridge this chasm between them is like they sort of reach for the tools they have, and the only shared language they have is like the commonness of violence. And so I mean, that's what happens when you get two very volatile men in a tense sexual tango of death. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned the last time that we spoke that people were like, oh, do they stay together at the end? Because we're so conditioned, especially with that kind of trope of the straight man and the gay man, thinking like, oh, there's going to be this fabulous love story. It's going to be beautiful. They're going to find themselves and realize, walk off into the sunset. And that is just not Wallace and Miller's endgame.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always taken aback by that question. Like, people, and I've seen it so many times, they're like, but like, do they stay together in the end? Like, interviewers have asked me, do they stay together in the end? Like, where do they go in the future? And I'm just like, how could you read this book and think that these two people are even going to be able to talk to each other on Tuesday? Like, they're just maybe that's just like really funny to me. Also, they shouldn't be together. Like, it would be so like, no, they shouldn't be. It's so dysfunctional. But
why? Yeah, why was it you wanted to kind of explore that dysfunction?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is like, I've had a lot of relationships in my life, like really fraught, intense encounters with straight men, and And I think it's like very, very common, like men who identify as straight who are drawn to other men because they have no other language for like intimacy. Like I feel like in some ways our culture deprives men of like a language around intimacy with other men. And that sort of weird bleed through of like emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy that can happen. And I'm just like deeply interested in that. I mean, it's like one of the most intense spaces in a person's life is when they encounter a person who sees them for the first time, a person with whom they have all of these affinities, and it changes your life. Like it fundamentally reorders what you imagine is possible, right? Like it completely changes your sense of the world and yourself and what you want and what you need, etc. And so, I mean, but that's not all roses. It's not all beauty and softness. Like it's like a fundamental, sometimes violent reconfiguration of your being, and sometimes your frustration with that like manifests in ways that are toxic. And yeah, I mean, that's just like a natural draw for me. But I think at heart, it's really, I'm just interested in human relations and how people come to be intimate and how they fall apart from each other. And you know, that to me is like the great subject of art in the world. I mean, Jane Austen, you know, one of my great heroes, does it all the time. Like her books are fundamentally about human relations, and yeah, I mean, I can't look away from it. It's just it's what drives me.
Because I know that you're a big fan of Andre Acimon's Call Me by Your Name, and I think people might have expected the kind of that kind of intense romance from Miller and Wallace, and it's just
no. No, it was never going to be. No, but it was a nice thought that the characters had. It was a nice weekend they had, you know.
Yeah.
I think in 2 minutes.
Yeah, in 2 minutes. So I just one more thing, and then I think we're going to go to some questions from the audience. But I wanted to ask you about the autobiographical word, and obviously people have very closely linked your life with the life of Wallace in the book, and I think people do that with Garth's work as well. They assume that there's this that it's sort of auto-fiction. And I was wondering what that means to you, that kind of autobiographical word. What does that mean to you?
I mean, I think that even if I were to write a novel about cow farmers on Mars, people would be like, is this autobiographical? I think it's just like a question people ask about fiction. But I was interested in writing this book and sort of taking the gross morphological features and landmarks of my life, lifting them from my life and putting them into fiction, and allowing the work of fiction to sort of act upon them, and fictionalizing parts of my life and parts of my experiences in ways that would allow me to act with more agency over them and to really punch down into questions that have plagued me my entire life. And so, you know, I considered the novel like this kind of virtual space to sort of revisit moments in my life and to ask interesting hypotheticals. And so, you know, I don't consider the novel to have like a dual nature of fiction, nonfiction. I think it is entirely fictional. The minute you change anything, it is entirely fictional, although I guess maybe autofiction writers would disagree with me. But it very much is a novel in which I'm thinking over questions that do come from my real, actual lived life. But and like, yes, if you view this book from 1,000 feet and look down, it looks a lot like my life. But when you get into the lived minutiae of the characters, you find that they are so vastly different from things have been remixed and fictionalized and rehashed 1,000 times in this book. And so like there's no longer a one-to-one correspondence between this book and anything in my actual life.
Yeah, and I guess something that when I spoke to Garth earlier this year for our interview, he said people sort of underestimate how fictional one's memory is as well. You know, memory is so fallible.
Yeah, I mean, Memory is so fungible and so susceptible to change, and I think that's one of Andre Aciman's great subjects as well, the way that we are constantly constructing ourselves and the like. So yeah, memory is fake. It's a story we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
Sort of quote Joan Didion on a slant. Yeah,
it's always, I mean, we, again, not to always talk about the Real Housewives, but it's something, you know, they say there's your version of the events, is your version of events, and there's the truth.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Everything is edited, including our memory.
Yeah.
I think she's coming back for the Q&A. It's so exciting. This is my favorite part.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that. That was amazing and such a wide-ranging conversation. I'm going to do a few comments first. More of a comment than a question. No, these are positive things that we just had come through that I want to share. So Silver says, I read the book twice. The first page is still so stressful for me. Lol. I can relate. R.L. Widman says, real life is stunning. Definitely a book of the decade, probably even a book of the century. I've got the dinner party scene. Phew. And I'm going to go to some questions. So David Evans asks, who are your writing heroes, and what's the one book or author that you think everyone should be reading?
Oh, my writing heroes. Andre Aciman, of course. Garth Greenwell, big fan. Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro are some of my absolute favorite writers. I mean, maybe I think Mavis Gallant's Varieties of Exile is what everyone should read. Book of short stories. Brilliant.
Great, thank you. Laura Gomez asks, I'd like to ask Brandon if he really sometimes writes 10,000 words in a day, and if so, how, please?
I do 10,000 words a day. I just do. I mean, lately I'm writing more like 5,000 words per day because I'm working on a novel. But it's just a matter of sitting down and 10,000 is right for me, but your number might vary.
I will ask my own follow-up question to that, which is that you're such a prolific tweeter. How do you organize your writing life around your life online?
Could you lower your speaker just like a tad? I can hear myself bouncing back. But what do I do? I mean, I just when I write, I just turn off Twitter and I just write for 2 or 3 hours. What really helps me is like setting like timers, 30-minute sprints. That really helps. So you can just like laser focus for a short period of time. And so I do a lot with timers. A lot of timers in my house.
Interesting.
Because Brandon, am I right in thinking that you have been taking a break from Twitter?
I took about like a week because it was making me, late summer crazies. But yeah, no, I'm back though. I'm tweeting all the time now. I'm back full time at my real job, which is Twitter.
Douglas had a question. Who do you write? Douglas Greenwood, sorry, had a question. Who do you write for, yourself or with a reader in mind?
I write for myself first and foremost. But the reader in the back of my mind is like a lonely, sad homosexual, and that's also a person I'm writing for. But first and foremost, I think that just keeps the anxiety down.
Lava Monstrous asks, speaking of Austen, which of her books is most slept on?
That's a great question. I mean, I think persuasion, because people love persuasion, but not enough people love persuasion. There could always be more people loving persuasion in my experience. I mean, I think it's one of our great novels of ideas, and it's one of our great just like novels about being a person in the world who changes their mind. And it's just so brilliant and sensitive and moving. And I read it like 3 times a year. So more people should read Persuasion. Although, small shout out to Northanger Abbey, which I recently read, and it is like so delightful.
Sorry about the echo. I'm now muting in between. I'm hoping that's helping. Silva asks, "What's your biggest influences in French?"
Oh, this is like maybe one of my favorite questions ever. I think Zola, of course. I love Zola. I love Proust, which are kind of like unoriginal answers. But I also love André Gide. Like he has this novel called L'Immoraliste, and it's so brilliant and just so spare and gorgeous and morally brutal. And it's just like so good. It's so luscious and beautiful. And I also I read as like a fun exercise, The Charterhouse of Parma by Stendhal, like in French. And it's not something I would do again, but it is just like in French, it is such a different experience. Like it's like a sprawling mess of a novel that has a bunch of like haunted rooms in it. It's just really, really good. But biggest influences, I would say Zola and André Gide, and Camus, of course. How could one not say Camus?
A great question from Aaron Correa, who says, "I haven't finished a novel yet, but one of the aspects that most resonated is the expectation from a graduate program that outside interests, like reading Proust, are a waste of time or an indication that a student isn't serious. Wondering if Brandon could elaborate on this a bit, either the way it works in the novel or from his personal experience."
Yeah, I mean, I think that was certainly something that I experienced. I will say that someone recently said that I was really harsh on Proust in the novel, and I will have people know that I really love Proust. And I feel like Wallace also likes Proust, and I saw that comment and did not appreciate it. My novel loves Proust, but I do think that, you know, sometimes I'd be in lab on my lunch break on the time of the day I had for myself, reading a book, and people would come in and be like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that? That's not a scientific article." Or I would go away for the summer to do writing retreats, and my advisor would be like, "Well, that's fine, but make sure that your lab work is in order." You know, there was this sense that like anything in science that wasn't directly science was a waste of time. I mean, you know, and I once went on this really horrible first date that was not a second date did not follow, where this guy was like, "What do you read? I hear you like to read." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I love like French literature and Jane Austen." And he goes, "No, like what real things do you read?" You know, like this sort of horrifying idea that if I wasn't reading, you know, Scientific American, I wasn't doing real reading. So I do think that there is this idea in academia that if you aren't, you know, constantly producing your sort of particular academic resource, that you aren't doing work that contributes to like a fully rounded or interesting scholarly or serious life. And people do tend to, I think in science, like consider fiction to be like a waste of time. Or so I thought until my book came out and all these scientists are like, "I love this, more of this, please." So, you know, I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of people who in science who do love reading. And I think that idea is changing, hopefully, finally.
Brandon Thomas Rennie says, "You've intended and executed truth, true life, real life beautifully, without ever switching genres. Would you pivot away from verisimilitude? Would that interest you?"
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, Real Life was a novel that I sort of like one might say it's ripped from the headlines of like my actual life. And I'm really, I mean, at heart, I'm like a hard-coded realist. I'm like so wed to like reality, but I am interested in the fungibility of reality and sort of interrogating like what is realism as a genre and a form, and asking questions about what are the things that that genre can contain and what can't it contain without seeming to become something else. And so I think I'm a realist. I think I'm always going to be a realist, but I am interested in different shades of realism and verisimilitude. I mean, I think that subsequent things I've written are less ripped from the headlines of my life, but they are all, I think, situated within a realist lens. I don't think that's going to change. Although I did write a story about space homosexuals, so maybe.
I think that's the perfect place to close up. Thank you so much, Brandon, and thank you, Alan, for this amazing conversation. Brandon's book, signed copies, are available, here it is, on our website, dogbooks.co.uk, and we'll also be making this conversation available online so people can watch it again. I'm sorry to the questions that we didn't get to, we just didn't have time. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.